Hello friends, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink with a very non-traditional sort of Halloween card. I was actually inspired by a random image in a random ad that I saw a couple weeks ago. I can't even remember. It stuck with me though, and my brain just kept mulling it over because people do ask sometimes the thought process. Generally, I can't always explain it. This one just evolved in many different ways. And when I ended up on most of it, this stencil was kind of just a afterthought almost. I was going to grab my products and this stencil was sitting there and I was like, why not? So the stencil is the Trinity Stamps Foliage Flare stencil set, and it's a set of 2. I had done a release and review video almost a month ago now on Trinity's fall and Halloween release, and I'll have a link to that at the end of this video if you haven't seen it, because there's tons of fabulous products, this being one of them. So I am blending Spun Sugar Distress Oxide ink and Victorian Velvet Distress Oxide ink over these stencils onto, I used white heavy stock, but in the end you could just any white cardstock is going to work. I wasn't sure. I knew I wanted to use a stencil and I was planning on using sprays and I wasn't 100% sure what I was going to do. So I went with the heavy stock in case I really wanted to go, mixed media. But after I blended the 2 inks, I wanted to soften this and I just used some Spun Sugar Distress Oxide spray. Hence me saying you could just use any white cardstock because I don't spray very heavily. I just use it to kind of add, it just adds that nice mist of color, the little oxide bits, all that sort of thing. So I just put those backgrounds into my splat box and then sprayed it with the Spun Sugar Distress Oxide spray. Once I'd sprayed these, I set them aside to dry, and then I got working on my sentiment. And I'm using the Spooky Hot Foil and Cut die set. So we've now switched to my glimmer camera, aka just my phone in a holder, where I have my glimmer hot foil machine and my die cut machine set up. So I have the Spooky Word hot foil plate on my glimmer machine. I turned it on, waited till the light was on, and then I put the foil pretty side facing the plate. Then I have some of Simon's cotton candy cardstock. I'd pressed the timer. Once the timer went off, I put the shim and the cutting plate over it, or plate over it, and ran it through my machine. Remove the foil, and I have this gorgeous gold foil sentiment on this pink cardstock. So I repeated the process a second time. So put the gold foil pretty side facing the hot foil plate, my cardstock, the shim, and the plate. Press the timer button, let that run until the timer button goes solid, and then run that through my Platinum 6 machine. Once that's run through, these sentiments are now foiled. With these ones, I did get a little bit of overfoiling, not a lot. When I have any overfoiling, I just use a combo of just a regular white eraser, and I also will use a sand eraser. When I'm using a regular eraser, don't press very hard if you're going over areas that you foiled, because you can remove that. So I'm just using really light pressure and removing some of the overfoiling, and then I'll use my little sand eraser that I will have a link to. That's just a handy thing to have if you don't have one. It's kind of one of those must-have little tools, because the sand eraser is not only good for removing overfoiling, it's also good if you've got little ink smears, things like that. I'll use the sand eraser and then I'll smooth it out with the regular eraser and I'm good to go. So with the sand eraser, I just use the very edge of the eraser and go in and just lightly rub the eraser, and it takes away any of that little excess foil bits and it's good to go. So I did that, and then I die cut it with the coordinating wafer die. Set those sentiments aside. I also die cut some craft heavy stock using the big tree dies from the SLIMLINE Spooky Scene wafer die set. And then that's where you see the leftover bits of cardstock here, because I wasn't going to, leave those to go to waste. So those bits of cardstock I stamped with some of the ghosts from the Sheets and Giggles stamp set, which I just love. Love this set. I love the style of it, the ghosts and the sentiments, and you guys know me and any punny sentiments. So I stamped those onto the craft heavy stock with VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. Then I'm using Speckled Egg and Picket Fence Distress Watercolor pencils. I have my shavings from the watercolor pencils in this palette. I have done a separate video on how I did this palette. That will also be linked at the end of this video, or possibly just in the upper right hand corner. It's on my channel anyway. So that's all that is. You can always use the watercolor pencils as is, you know, scribble them and then paint, or hold the pencil, pick up the color with the water brush. Anything works. I just am really liking having it in a palette form. So I use that to paint these ghosts with my little water brush, and I kept the piece in my MISTI so it's still lined up, because these watercolor pencils do have pigments in them, so you can see they're obscuring the stamp lines, which, depending on the look you're going for, could be totally fine. But I do genuinely like restamping everything, so that's what I did. Once everything was dry, I restamped it so I get all the detail back of the stamped image. And then I'll die cut these with the coordinating wafer die set. And then, speaking of die cutting, I did a whole bunch more die cutting. This time I'm using my little Gemini Mini, because I die cut just a ton of little bitty pieces. I'd gone through my stash and I pulled out Trinity's Wildflower Clippings die set. There's this little flower in the set. So I die cut this multiple times from some more cotton candy cardstock, as well as Lawn Fawn pink eraser cardstock. I think that's what it's called. Or pencil eraser cardstock. I'll have a link to that as well. So it's very similar to Victorian Velvet Distress ink. So die cut a ton of flowers, and then I die cut the greenery, a couple of the green. There's a bunch of different like branches and whatnot in that die set, but I chose a couple, and I die cut some distress watercolor paper, and I left all the die cuts in the watercolor paper just to have something to kind of hold them in place, because these are very, you know, finely detailed, and I wanted to add color to them with Oxide inks. I could have just die cut these from green cardstock, but this is a fun way to add color as well as like texture and depth and all that. So I blended on peeled paint Distress Oxide ink onto these die cuts, and then I'm going to spray it with water. And because they are water reactive, everything is going to move around, and I'm going to get like just variations and texture and all that fun stuff. So I set those aside, and then the other set of greenery, I did the exact same thing, but this time with Rustic Wilderness Distress Oxide spray. So I just used a small blending brush and just added the ink. Doesn't need to be a good blend. It literally doesn't matter. Like this Oxide inks especially, but Distress inks are obviously very water reactive, but I find Oxide inks are even more water reactive because they've got the pigments in them, so everything's sitting on top of the paper a little bit more. So that's where you just like the minute water, you know, when I spray the water, it just immediately moves, which again gives it all that texture and just all the variations that I love. I need to do this more often. Like my brain's already like onto the next, you know, project. I'm like, So you can let them air dry or dry with a heat tool. Either one works. It honestly doesn't matter. But I completely dried these. So now I've got a bunch of greenery with just texture to it, you know, love it. So I dried all these, and then I popped all the die cuts out of their scraps basically. And then for the inside of the card, I'm going to use one of the ghosts, and I had stamped one of the sentiments from the Sheets and Giggles stamp set onto that pencil eraser cardstock, and I'd used the coordinating wafer die to die cut that. So it says, "You're fabulous." Adhered that to the inside of the card. And then the panel that I had used the stencils on, I trimmed that down to smaller than my A2 card front, and I'm going to adhere that into place with some craft tacky glue. And then I've got my big trees from the SLIMLINE Spooky Scene. And you can see, like, these are huge. Love, because they will work perfectly on a SLIMLINE card. So I die cut those, like I said, from Distress Craft Heavy Stock. And I'm going to adhere those onto this card front with craft tacky glue. And then once I've got that adhered into place, I'm going to start adhering all of that greenery just all along the bottom. Just kind of like layering it up to, again, create this fun little scene. So I'm not going to worry about any of the bits hanging over, because I'm going to trim that off once I get all of the greenery adhered into place as well. So got my trees adhered, and then I'm just going to start layering in all of those greenery pieces, which of course are now completely dry. So just little dabs of the craft tacky glue, and I just start adhering them just kind of randomly along the bottom of this card. And then once those are in place, I can flip this card over and trim off everything that is hanging off the edge with scissors, using just the edge of the card base as my guide. Just got that trimmed off. And then my ghosts I adhered with some thin foam squares, so they're popped out with just a little bit of dimension. And I did the same thing with that spooky foiled sentiment. I used some thin foam squares and some craft tacky glue and popped that into place. And then to finish off this card, I'm using all those little die cut flowers that I die cut from the 2 shades of pink cardstock. I'm going to adhere these all around the card. And then for the centers, I just used the smaller gems from the rose tinted glasses, Trinity's embellishment mix. So I adhered those into place. And then the final embellishment, but wait, there's more. I have these gold star embellishments. I didn't even know I had these. Again, when I was like digging through my stash trying to find something, I came across this container and I was like, oh yes, these are perfect for everything. Because I have the Oh My Stars ones, the silver holographic ones that I love and I've used in a ton of videos. There's gold ones too, and these have been out for months. They're fabulous. Anyway, I adhered a bunch of those around the background because the gold foil, of course, goes with the gold foil sentiment. And then I'm going to pair these cards with metallic cotton candy envelopes, and that's going to finish them off. These were a lot of fun to create, a very different sort of style, kind of mixed media in a sense that I used all sorts of random things to pull all of this together. And as always, I will have links below the video. I'll have a link to my blog post. I'll have a supply list. I'll link to all the supplies I used. So you can check that out below if you are interested. And then at the end of this video, I'll have a link to my 2022 Halloween playlist because there's quite a few videos in it so far. And yeah, thank you guys so much for thumbs upping and commenting. Subscribe if you hadn't. I very much appreciate you watching my videos, and I'll see you all very soon in the next one. Bye.